Okay, welcome back, everyone. So this is video 2 of part 6, which is called The Return of the Great Mother. Let's do it. So this is the video where I get to ruin all future chances I have of having a career in academia. Oh well, their loss. So out of the madness of postmodernism, right? We talked in the last video about this collective descent into psychosis that was experienced by Western intellectual and artistic culture. There has emerged a new kind of religion, what I'm going to call a religion, what other people have called a religion, a feminine religion. This stupid and pernicious ideology has infected artistic and intellectual culture. Goes by the name of, I don't know, it's got a lot of names: multiculturalism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice, intersectionality, wokeness. I don't care what you call it. It's all the same. It is a form of institutionalized stupidity because it forces you to believe, or at least to mouth, blatantly stupid and pathological ideas. If you want to get a job, if you want to get a grant, if you want to get a promotion, if you want to avoid social exclusion in academia, or avoid being called all of the mean names like a racist, a sexist, transphobe, blah, 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 blah. If you want to avoid all that, you have to at least pretend to go along with it in some way or another. I'm going to argue that it is a parody of feminine values. It's a perversion of femininity, and that it elevates the least admirable traits that can be found in human beings, what Nietzsche called ressentiment, to the highest of virtues. Its teachings are anti-wisdom. They are the opposite of wisdom. And we'll talk about that too. So that's what we're going to talk about. So I got this very interesting YouTube comment, which despite its grammar errors, I'm going to read and respond to here, because I kind of suspect that the things that this person is bringing up are things that other people are going to bring up, or at least would be thinking in relation to me talking about this stuff. And so, yeah, I'm going to read it. He said, "You need to be careful talking about woke, DEI, social justice. You know it's about increasing awareness and sensitivity. Do I know that? Do I know that? I've been in academia, or I've been in the academic world for 6 years now. You'd think I might know better by now. No, what I know is that I've seen this bullshit firsthand with my own eyes on many occasions. They're little priests and priestesses who like to exclude anybody who disagrees with their stupid ideas. Okay, that's what I see. I don't see increasing awareness and sensitivity. I'm going to talk about what I see. I'm going to talk about what I've seen with my own two eyes. Okay, which has been the arc of history, especially the past 100 to 200 years. And yes, it has become too dogmatic in its own way. And that obviously conservatives and the power establishment want to stereotype it. Okay, let's pause there for a second. Okay, I would like to know why in the world I should care at all about what conservatives are doing. I'm not a conservative. I don't care about politics. Politics is irrelevant to me. In our last political election, we put forward what is essentially a geriatric patient with dementia against somebody who's clearly a narcissistic egomaniac and sexual predator. Right? So those were our two options in the last political. Fuck politics. I don't care about politics. This is not a political issue. It's not a political issue in the slightest. They want to use it as a tool of rage and division. Do you think maybe that calling everybody who disagrees with your stupid little ideology a racist and a sexist and a transphobe and a Nazi and all this, do you think that might be a tool of rage and division? I think it is. They're using it as a tool of rage and division. So who cares? All these things take time to sort out, and it's way too early to try to judge what is occurring. Actually, I think I'll make that decision for myself. Thank you. In the battle for normativity, there will always be things that swing too far. But how many have been deeply scarred and traumatized by the existing racist patriarchy? Yeah, racism is a terrible thing, right? It's terrible. It's complicated, and it's terrible. This ideology is making it worse. It makes it worse. It institutionalizes racism, as far as I'm concerned. There is a real, there are very real ways to respond to racism. This ain't it. This little stupid thing that's emerged out of the universities and the humanities and in journalism and politics in general. It's the opposite of anti-racism. It makes it worse. I'd advise not to get political about it. Well, I don't really care about your advice for one random person on the internet. I don't have any problem with you, but who cares what you mean? You're a random person. But besides that, this is not a political issue. It's literally a religious issue. It is a religion. There has emerged within the universities, within university culture, within academia, within journalism, within the activist culture around this stuff. It is the emergence of a new religion within Western culture. It's not a political movement at all. Right? They're little priests. They're priests. Right? They're priests and priestesses. Nor to use disparaging or offensive language to describe it. How about to say what it is? It's bullshit. It's bullshit. That's what it is. And I'm going to call it that because that's what it is. That seems contrary to your whole purported mission here as I understand it. My mission here is to say things that I believe to be true and relevant to the task at hand. And that's what I'm going to do. Maybe you don't understand my mission, but that is my mission. My mission is to say things that I believe are true and relevant to the thesis of this series of videos. And what I'm going to talk about in this video is, I think, true, and I think it's relevant to my thesis. So I'm going to say it, regardless of whether it, I assume some people won't be happy about it. What do I care? It's not my problem. Salman Rushdie said, I should be happier about this, the quietest option, if I did not believe that it matters. It always matters to name rubbish as rubbish, and that to do otherwise is to legitimize it. And I agree. I think this ideology, this little religion that has emerged within the universities is rubbish. I think it's garbage. And so that's what I'm going to say. And I'm going to try to explain why I think it's garbage in this video. So let's do that. Out of the wreckage of postmodernism, the madness of postmodernism, a new ideology began to emerge. It's been happening for the last probably, 50, 60 years. Postmodernists, of course, they questioned and deconstructed all notions of truth and value and hierarchy. And the logical conclusion of deconstruction, right? If you say, if you're questioning all hierarchies of value, or you're deconstructing all of them, what's the logical conclusion of that? The logical conclusion of that is that everything is of equal value, right? Or because everything is really of no ultimate value at all. But that means that everything is of equal value. And so the logical conclusion of deconstruction is that everything is intrinsically equal, right? Equally meaningless, but equal nonetheless. And so in the humanities and elsewhere, there began to emerge a new ideology, an ideology that took this equality very seriously. Farber and Sherry, in their 1997, I put Farber and Sherry, in their 1997 book, Beyond All Reason, The Radical Assault on Truth in American Law, they documented the rise of this ideology within law schools. They documented the emergence of an ideology that put forward radical critiques of truth and merit. They were especially attacking the idea that there is any such thing as objective truth and any such thing as merit. And of course, they have a long argument, and they document all of this in the book. So I'm reading from the conclusion of their book, and they state that the critique of merit holds that the rules for distributing social goods, such as good jobs or educational slots, have no inherent validity and are merely means by which the elite maintains its dominance. For many important positions, however, the key to merit is supposed to be some kind of knowledge. Expertise in cardiac physiology or in the functioning of securities markets or in 19th century history. So, to challenge the concept of merit is also to challenge expertise, and this in turn puts in question the truths of which the expert claims to have special knowledge, end quote. And so you can see the chain of logic here, right? If there's no such thing as merit, right? If the distribution of power in society, right? Because this is what they're getting at. The distribution of power in society is totally arbitrary and unfair. It's all just a power game. And, people talk about meritocracy, but that's all a lie, according to the multiculturalists. All of that is a lie, right? Merit doesn't exist. Everything is distributed in a totally unfair, arbitrary way that's based on nothing but pure dominance and power, right? Okay, well, if you're going to do that, then you have to say that expertise, right? Because, of course, people go to med school or whatever for years and they gain all of this expertise, but you have to challenge that too, because that would mean that those people actually do have some kind of merit. And if you're going to challenge expertise, that puts into question the idea that any knowledge can be had about anything at all. They go on to say, specifically, Consider a history professor who specializes in modern European history. A prerequisite for possessing merit in this field is an expert knowledge of the history of Europe. But to say that somebody has expert knowledge is necessarily to say that various beliefs about the subject are not all equally meritorious. Some are better than others, which is to say truer. If there is no intrinsic difference between a terrible historian and a competent one, it must follow that there is also no intrinsic reason why one set of beliefs about the past, those held by the terrible historian, are worse than another, those held by the competent historian, end quote. And so in the worldview, right, that's being put forward with these radical critiques of truth and merit, everything is of equal value, and therefore no history, right? The history of the terrible historian can't be any more true than the history of the good historian, or vice versa. And so it's a leveling out of everything, right? They're saying no merit, no truth, no expertise, no knowledge, right? All of that, is just a power game. They go on to say, and I quote, "Thus, radical multiculturalism has a conceptual core of beliefs about the social construction of law, truth, and merit. This conceptual core provides strong support for other positions held by radical multiculturalists. If merit is just a dominance game, there can be no objective argument against changing the rules through affirmative action or otherwise to obtain immediate proportional representation of all groups. If law is indeterminate, we need not worry about the First Amendment in crafting rules against hate speech or pornography. Once we decide where we want to go, constitutional law will dutifully follow along like a well-trained dog. Artistic or other merit being purely socially constructed, we need not worry about that anti-pornography or hate speech rules will impinge on valuable expression. And since truth is also socially constructed, we don't have to worry that these regulations of speech will impede the search for truth." End quote. And so this is why we see out of this ideology, there is no belief in free speech. I've interacted with these people multiple times. They may give lip service to free speech. They don't care about it at all, right? They think if you say anything that's problematic, that's hate speech or whatever, and you can't say that. Okay, so they use these words. They use words like problematic and hate speech. And then they say, well, I believe in free speech. I just don't think hate speech is free speech. Well, no. You don't believe in free speech, right? Because you don't get to decide what other people get to say. But you have to understand this. All this stuff is logically integrated. If you don't believe, and by the way, I mean, people on the periphery of the ideology, they don't understand the core of it, but it doesn't matter because they're affected by these ideas. And so if you don't believe that real knowledge can be had, or that there's any such thing as merit or any such thing as real expertise, then of course you don't believe in free speech, right? Why would you, right? All speech is equal and all of it's just a power game anyways. And so you want to assert the interests of let's say the less powerful. Well, free speech is just an obstacle to that, at least within their worldview. So intellectual culture has, of course, largely moved past postmodernism. Not all of it, but generally speaking, it has, and into something that is different. It's nonetheless continuous with postmodernism in that it emerged out of it. The ideology that has captured much of the humanities, much of intellectual and artistic culture in general, and increasingly the sciences and increasingly the corporate world, is no longer one of disorientation or irony or despair, right? Because that's largely what postmodernism was. But rather, it's one of certainty and moralism and ideological rigidity, equality and justice. Right? This is basically what's at the core, right? They want equality and they want justice. These are its so-called virtues, which Nietzsche rightly understood as the products of a deep ressentiment. And we're going to talk more about that here in a minute. Because what they mean by equality and what they mean by justice is not what everybody else means. It's not what I would mean by these words. And it's very hard not to notice that the ideology within the humanities has a very feminine character. You look at the posters they put up, and they look like they're made for infants half the time. But in most of its primary architects, or at least many of its primary architects, have been women, which makes it very different from basically every other ideology that has ever existed. Most ideologies are created by men. But this one was largely, even though the postmodernists themselves were mostly men, many of the architects of this thing that has emerged out of postmodernism have been women. So I'm going to quote from this book, Cynical Theories, here by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. I have to say something about James Lindsay while we're here. So I think that James Lindsay did good work in this book, and Helen Pluckrose is a lovely person, but my God, is James Lindsay embarrassing on Twitter. He's so embarrassing. that it's actually like it made me consider not quoting this stuff, but whatever. I've read this book. I've looked at their references. They do a good job of following the emergence of this ideology out of postmodernism. I think it's a good work of scholarship, and so I'm going to quote it regardless of James Lindsay being embarrassing on Twitter. So they said about this, and I quote, that while the original postmodern theorists were fairly aimless, using irony and playfulness to reverse hierarchies and disrupt what they saw as unjust power and knowledge or power knowledge structures, the second wave of applied postmodernists focused on dismantling hierarchies and making truth claims about power, language, and oppression. During its applied turn, theory underwent a moral mutation. It adopted a number of beliefs about the rights and wrongs of power and privilege. The original theorists were content to observe, bemoan, and play with such phenomena. The new ones wanted to reorder society. If social injustice is caused by legitimizing bad discourses, they reasoned, social justice can be achieved by delegitimizing them and replacing them with better ones. Those social science and humanities scholars who took theoretical approaches began to form a left-wing moral community rather than a purely academic one, an intellectual organ more interested in advocating a particular ought than attempting a detached assessment of is, an attitude we usually associate with churches rather than universities, end quote. And that is what has happened within the universities. There is a moral community, and of course it is associated with the political left, but it's beyond that, right? There's lots of people on the left who think this stuff is really dumb. It's its own thing, right? It's its own little church. And it is, they say we usually associate this with churches rather than universities because that's what it is. It's a little religion that has grown up within the universities. So we went from postmodernism, this irony and uncertainty and this sort of playfulness in some sense, to moralism and ideological rigidity. And of course, the most cited scholar in the humanities is Foucault, and a lot of this stuff did emerge out of Foucault's writing, rightly or wrongly. It's not clear that Foucault actually would approve of a lot of this stuff, but that's a different issue. Bruce Bawer, in this 2012 book, he documented the emergence of this stuff in the humanities, and in his book, The Victim's Revolution. I think it's a really good book, and he's a journalist, and so he kind of tells it as a story, which makes it very entertaining to read. So he said about this, and I quote, that once the humanities had been concerned with the true, the good, and the beautiful. Now they were preoccupied with an evil triumvirate of isms, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and with a three-headed monster of victimhood, class, race, and gender oppression. Once, the purpose of the humanities had been to introduce students to the glories of Western civilization, thought, and art, to enhance students' respect, even reverence, for the cultural heritage of the West. Now the humanities sought to unmask the West as a perpetrator of injustice around the globe. Once, the great poets, authors, philosophers, historians, and artists of the Western canon had been heroes whose portraits and statues adorned university campuses. Now they were to be viewed with a jaundiced eye, for most of them were, after all, dead white heterosexual males, and therefore, by definition, members of an oppressive establishment, end quote. I mean, this is ressentiment, right? A rebellion against everything that is beautiful and great and powerful, because that is what the Western tradition is. It is beautiful, right? Despite its problems. It is beautiful and it's great. And the slander of it within the humanities is a pathology. It's a rot. It's a rot at the core of the university. John McWhorter recently wrote a book called Woke Racism: How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. And he describes what he believes is literally a new religion among the intelligentsia. Mainly, he's referring to academics, journalists, and the political class. And he, in the introduction to the book, he writes about his motivations. And I think his motivations are interesting. So I'm going to quote him here. He said, and I quote, that I write this viscerally driven by the fact that the ideology in question is one under which white people, calling themselves our saviors, of course John McWhorter is black, white people calling themselves our saviors make black people look like the dumbest, weakest, most self-indulgent human beings in the history of our species, and teach black people to revel in that status and cherish it as making us special. I am especially dismayed at the idea of this indoctrination infecting my daughter's sense of self. I can't always be with them, and this anti-humanist ideology may seep into their school curriculum. I shudder at the thought. Teachers with eyes shining at the prospect of showing their anti-racism by filling my daughter's head with performance art, instructing them that they are poster children rather than individuals, end quote. And that is what the new ideology teaches. You are not really an individual, right? You are your race or your gender or your sexuality or who cares. These are the most uninteresting things about people as far as I'm concerned. And it tells you that they're actually really important and interesting. And I don't believe it. Anyways, whatever. But yeah, John McWhorter, I think, and I know other people who are very worried about their children being indoctrinated into this silliness. McWhorter, in his book, documents the many instances in which someone who has questioned the dogmas of what he calls the elect, right? This is his name for the new religion, the elect. He documents the many instances in which people question this and have been canceled. And commenting on this, he says, and I quote, that the elect consider it imperative to not only critique those who disagree with their creed, but to seek their punishment and elimination to whatever degree real-life conditions can accommodate. There is an overriding sense that unbelievers must be not just spoken out against, but called out, isolated, and banned. A little later, he asks, why can't they allow other views? Remember, this is religion, not political science, and specifically a religion eerily akin to devout Christianity. End quote. And that's what has to be understood. This is a religion. It acts like a religion. It quacks like a religion. It's a religion. He says about this, and I quote, that something must be understood. I do not mean that these people's ideology is like a religion. I seek no rhetorical snap in the comparison. I mean that it actually is a religion. An anthropologist would see no difference in type between Pentecostalism and this new form of anti-racism. Language is always imprecise, and thus we have traditionally restricted the word religion to certain ideologies founded in creation myths, guided by ancient texts, and requiring that one subscribe to certain beliefs beyond the reach of empirical experience. This, however, is an accident, just as it is that we call tomatoes vegetables rather than fruits. If we rolled the tape again, the word religion could easily apply as well to more recently emerged ways of thinking within which there is no explicit requirement to subscribe to unempirical beliefs, even if the school of thought does reveal itself to entail such beliefs upon analysis. One of them is this extremist version of anti-racism today, end quote. And so, of course, in John McWhorter's book, he's mainly concerned with with the anti-racism part of this ideology. But of course, the ideology itself is an integrated set of beliefs that it not only has to do with racism, but also sex and sexuality and politics and so on, which flows out from its focus on battling power relations. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But of course, deviation from the orthodoxy, right, is not really met with argument. They might make arguments occasionally, but generally speaking, they just morally condemn you. You're a bad person. If you don't agree with them, it's not that you're just wrong, right? You're a bad person. You're evil, right? Well, of course, that's what religious people think, right? Religious people think that heretics are evil. It's a religion. At the core of the new religion is a particular ethos, which McWhorter suggests goes something like this. And I quote, battling power relations and their discriminatory effects must be the central focus of all human endeavor, be it intellectual, moral, civic, or artistic. Those who resist this focus or even evidence insufficient adherence to it must be sharply condemned, deprived of influence, and ostracized. And so what does it mean to battle power relations, right? That's what he's saying is at the core of this religion, battling power relations. He's referring here to the unequal distribution of power. And so the central value of the new religion is equality, essentially, but not the kind of equality that I think most people think of when they think of equality. Definitely not the kind of equality that the founding fathers had in mind when they wrote the Declaration and they said that all men are created equal. And that's not the kind of equality that they're after. We'll come back to that issue. McWhorter suggests that the new religion is eerily akin to devout Christianity, and he's not the first person to notice that connection. In fact, I'm not going to talk about this too much in this video. I have a Substack article where I talk about this, but it's a continuation of Christianity. It emerged out of Christianity. That's a complicated argument, and I'm not going to get into that in this video. You can read my Substack article, which I'll put the link to in the description. It's called "On the Hatred of the Behavioral Genetics of Intelligence." But McWhorter describes the fervor of the elect as such in his book, and I quote, "The reality is that what the elect call problematic is what a Christian means by blasphemous. The elect do not ban people out of temper. They do it calmly, between sips of coffee as they surf Twitter, because they consider it the higher wisdom to burn witches. Not literally, but the sentiment is the same. The elect are members of a religion, of a kind within which the dissenter is not just someone in disagreement, but is a kind of environmental pollution, end quote. And if you haven't been around these types of people, then you don't really know what he means. Right? Like if you say something that goes against one of their, and oftentimes these things are really stupid, but one of their dogmas, they'll look at you like you've just said the sky is green, and they look at you like you're some kind of you're just an anomaly. Right? It's so funny, because it's clear to me that many of these people they're so sheltered within their group, right, that they just never hear opinions outside of it. But they're little priests, right? They're little priests and priestesses, right? They metaphorically burn heretics from the comfort of their home on Twitter. Right? That's what they are. They're priests. So I think McWhorter is right to call it a religion. I think he's wrong in another way, however, to suggest that it's something that's very new. So he thinks this is very new. I don't think it's new. I think it's been around for a while. I think that he mistakes what are essentially superficial changes in vocabulary with the emergence of an entirely new worldview. And I think that the elect are the same as the people who Thomas Sowell wrote this book called The Vision of the Anointed in 1995, and he calls them the anointed. Right? The anointed and the elect are the same. And the people who Thomas Sowell are calling the anointed are the same people that John McWhorter is calling the elect. They're the intellectual descendants of the same people. So in both cases, McWhorter and Sowell are referring to people in academia, journalism, law, and politics with a very particular kind of worldview that is centered around what they call equality and justice. And these are people who treat their detractors not as opponents to be debated or as people to have an argument with, but as heretics to be morally condemned. Right? That's how they react to disagreement. They morally condemn. Sowell documents the emergence of this vision of the world, right? This worldview, up to about 200 years ago, at the end of the 18th century, and it's no coincidence. This is something I go into in my Substack article. It's no coincidence that this coincides with the beginning of the decline of Christian beliefs among Western intellectuals. So as soon as you lose the Christian Aristotelian worldview, this thing begins to emerge out of it. Right? It begins to make its way forward. At the heart of the vision of the anointed is the presumption that they have superior wisdom and superior virtue, while their detractors are morally tainted, or stupid, or both. They are little priests and priestesses, and this is why they don't really need arguments or facts. Right? They selectively call upon them when necessary, but they don't need that. Right? They can just call you a racist or a sexist or a transphobe or whatever. If you disagree with one of their little dogmas, they just call you a bunch of names and they socially exclude you and they keep you from getting a job and so on, because that's what they are. Right? They're a group of little priests. So for those whom McWhorter calls the elect and those whom Sowell calls the anointed, the professed goal is essentially the same. And of course, it's not a coincidence, right, that they're calling them the elect and the anointed, because that's the vibe you get from these kinds of people, right? They see themselves as the anointed ones, as essentially the ones who are going to bring about the utopia. That's how they see themselves. And their goal is the same, right? They claim to be concerned with the distribution of power in society, and they have a very particular conception of justice in which power is going to be distributed fairly, according to them. But as I've said, their sense of justice and their sense of fairness is generally quite different from the average person, because for most people, justice consists of being treated equally. All right, so like if I go to a job interview, I want to be treated, I want to be given the same chance as everybody else based on my qualifications for the job, right? How good am I going to be at the job, right? That's when justice is served. That's not right for them. Right? Treating people equally is just another way of perpetuating inequality. Within Western culture, there are two competing ways of understanding equality and justice, and these are still competing for what you might say dominance in our culture. The intuitive way of understanding these terms, what I would suggest is how most people understand them, even if they don't have an explicit understanding of what it is. This is how most people intuitively understand things like equality and justice, is in terms of a process. While this group of intellectuals, right, the anointed or the elect, have redefined these terms to be about states or about outcomes. And so if you're defining equality and justice as a process, right, then when the process is equal, right, when the process is applied equally to everyone, the differences in outcome are not unjust, right? They are what they are. If you're defining equality or justice as a state in the world, right, as an outcome, then regardless of the process by which the outcomes are determined, the outcome has to be equal, or the outcome has to be fair, or else there is injustice. And so the elect or the anointed, they see equality and justice in terms of being a state rather than as a process. But as Thomas Sowell points out, and as should be relatively obvious, but it's not obvious to everybody, obviously. But the goal of equal outcomes, right? If you're trying to engineer equal outcomes in society, this requires you to be an authoritarian, right? It requires you to have a certain amount of control and omniscience that is impossible in practice and totally destructive when it's pursued directly. And so, when I'm criticizing these notions here, criticizing what they call equality and what they call justice, I'm criticizing them conceptualized in terms of a state rather than a process, because I believe, in procedural equality and procedural justice, right? I'm an advocate of, generally speaking, of procedural equality and procedural justice, but not their version of equality and justice. Their version of equality and justice is antithetical to procedural equality and procedural justice. You can't have both. You cannot have procedural equality and equality of outcome at the same time. Right? Because if you have procedural equality, you will see differences in outcomes, even among demographic groups or between the sexes or people of whatever. However you want to divide people up, you're going to see differences in outcome if you have procedural equality. And so if you're going to commit to procedural equality, you're going to have to accept that the outcomes are not going to be equal. Get over it. Well, and they are oftentimes very explicit about this. Delgado and Stefancic, in this book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction, are explicit about their rejection of procedural equality. So they say, and I quote, that critical race theorists are also highly suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. Particularly, some of the older, more radical CRT scholars with roots in racial realism and an economic view of history believe that moral and legal rights are apt to do the right holder much less good than many would like to think. Rights are almost always procedural, for example, to a fair process, rather than substantive, for example, to food, housing, or education. Think how our system applauds affording everyone equality of opportunity, but resists programs that assure equality of results, end quote. Well, thank God for that, right? I mean, thank God that our system is, for the most part, about equality of opportunity. Because it would be hell if we pursued equality of outcome in general. It would be hell on earth. That's what the pursuit of that gets you Soviet Russia, essentially. Thomas Sowell wrote this book called, or actually it was an essay called The Quest for Cosmic Justice. In a speech about that, he said, and I quote, that in a sense, proponents of social justice are unduly modest. What they are seeking to correct are not merely the deficiencies of society, but of the cosmos. What they call social justice encompasses far more than any given society is causally responsible for. Crusaders for social justice seek to correct not merely the sins of man, but the oversights of God or the accidents of history. What they are really seeking is a universe tailor-made to their vision of equality. They are seeking cosmic justice, end quote. And that is what they're seeking. So why is it that the purveyors of this religion are so arrogant and so dismissive towards anyone who disagrees with them? In large part, it's because their entire identity, right, as moral people, right, they think of themselves as really good people. They think of themselves as really moral and good people. And that entire identity as being a good person, because probably they're pretty fucking useless in general. But, they're a good person, right? They're a moral and good person. And so if you get rid of that, right, well, then their entire identity is gone, right? Like that's their whole identity. That's their whole self-esteem is tied up within this moral identity that they have. And so if you disagree with them about that, you're not just disagreeing with them about some abstract belief, right? You're disagreeing with them about their identification as a good and moral person. And they are going to protect that. viciously. Soul says, and I quote, that the only clear-cut winners in the quest for cosmic justice are those who believe in the vision it projects, a vision in which those believers are so morally and/or intellectually superior to others that their own relentless pursuit of this vision is seen as all that offers some modicum of hope to those who would otherwise be victims of the lesser people who make up the rest of society. It is a very self-flattering vision, and hence one that is not easily given up. Evidence to the contrary is not only likely to be dismissed, but is often blamed on the malevolence or dishonesty of those who present such evidence. It is difficult to explain the fury and ruthlessness of those with this vision of cosmic justice whenever they are challenged by the simple fact that they consider policy A to be better than policy B. What is at stake for them is not merely a policy option, but a whole vision of the world and of their place in that world. No wonder it is seldom possible to have rational discussions of some of these issues. And it is impossible. I don't try anymore. But when I was younger and a little bit more naive, I would try to have like real rational discussions with some of these types of people about controversial issues, like behavioral genetics, right? So like the behavioral genetics of intelligence is something that really, they just don't like this stuff. But, there's overwhelming evidence for a heritable general factor of intelligence. Okay, try to have a conversation about that with somebody for whom that belief is tied up with their identity of being like a good and moral person. Yeah, well, it's just not going to happen. It's talking to a brick wall. It's like talking to a religious person. It is talking to a religious person. There's no getting past it. Right? Their whole identity is tied up in it. So it's the case that neither McWhorter or Soul do an in-depth psychological analysis of the elect or the anointed. Nietzsche did do this. Nietzsche recognized this same pattern occurring in his own time. Of course, he was writing at the end of the 19th century, and Soul argued that the vision of the anointed emerged in the early 1800s. And so Nietzsche was seeing the emergence of this new religion in his own time. And he did do a psychological analysis of what's at the bottom of it. So we're going to talk about that. Time and again, throughout history, the attempt has been made to sanctify the desire for revenge as the desire for justice. The anti-Semites in Germany, what they really wanted was revenge against the Jews. The Jews were extremely successful in Germany, but anti-Semites everywhere, right across Europe. Ashkenazi Jews were incredibly successful in Europe, and the anti-Semites said that what they wanted was justice, but what they really wanted was revenge. And the anarchists, say that they want justice against the powerful, but really they want revenge. And today too, the elect or the anointed say that they want justice, but what they really mean is revenge. They mean revenge against anybody who has power. Douglas Murray wrote this book in 2022 called The War on the West. And he also suggests, like Nietzsche, that the elect are really after revenge. And they disguise this desire for revenge with noble-sounding words like equality and justice. And so Douglas Murray says about this, and I quote, that just as the men of resentment talk about justice while meaning revenge, so it is that something is disguised within their talk of equality. For anyone who talks of equality will find an inbuilt problem. Only a person who fears he will lose will demand equality as a universal principle. It is a speculation on a falling market. For all talk of equality, like the talk of justice, presents itself in a disinterested light, as though its proponents only want an abstract thing, and hardly notice whether or not this thing will ever benefit themselves. But very often it is no such thing. A set of far more fundamental issues are working themselves out. For just as we are not up against justice, but rather up against vengeance, so we are not truly up against proponents of equality, but also against those who hold a pathological desire for destruction. End quote. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. So again, we want to make sure that we're clear about this, because we're talking about equality of outcome here. Because if you believe that you can compete within the market, let's say, within a real hierarchy of competence, then what you want is procedural equality. You want the process to be fair, because that will allow you to rise. But if you're somebody who speculates on a falling market, that is, if you think that actually deep down you're kind of a loser and totally incompetent, well, then what you want is equality of outcome, because then it doesn't matter that you're an incompetent loser, right? then you can have the fruits of everybody who's not such an incompetent loser as well. And that is essentially the underlying motivation for demanding equality of outcome. At least for many people, I think it is. So Murray suggests here that the proponents of the new religion want revenge, right? But revenge against what exactly? And I think Nietzsche understood the answer to this question all too well. The answer is that they want revenge against anything that has power. Before we get to that, we'll need to lay some groundwork. So you may recall from part 5, we had this discussion about altruism and the false dichotomy of altruism and egoism. And this discussion that everybody is always pursuing their evolved interests, right? You can do this consciously or you can do it unconsciously, but you're always doing it. You can't get out of your biology, right? You can't get out of, it's what you are at bottom. And some people use morality to do this, right? Some people use morality to advance their interests in the world. Now, of course, they construe their motivations as being purely disinterested, right? As being purely altruistic, right? That's how everybody construes their moral virtues, but it's not, right? Because that's impossible. It's something that doesn't exist in nature. There is no such thing as pure altruism. So then we can ask, right, the people who are putting this forward as their morality, what is it exactly that they're doing, right? Because they say they're acting purely altruistically, but I don't believe them. So what are they doing? What are they doing in promoting this religion that is focused on equality and justice? So Nietzsche had an answer to this question, and I think that Nietzsche was right. And so we're going to go over that. What he believed underlied the emergence of this religion centered around equality was what he called ressentiment. Ressentiment is a French word. It's a play on the word resentment. But ressentiment is not resentment, not really. Right? Resentment can be a good thing. Right? If somebody's treating you unfairly, you should feel resentful, and then you should do something about it. Ressentiment is a little different. And so what I'm going to read now is something that I wrote. I wrote it for an article that I haven't published yet, but I will at some point. And so this is a kind of thought experiment that is a summary of Nietzsche's thesis about the development of ressentiment in an individual. And so maybe you can play along with me here. Imagine, if you will, that you are somebody who doesn't have much going for you. In this hypothetical scenario, you are not beautiful, you are not charismatic or athletic or creative. The opposite sex doesn't pine for you, nobody respects you, and you've never really won at anything in your life, and it's doubtful that things are going to change much in the future. At the same time, you look around and you see that some people just have it easy. Some people are born into loving families. They have beautiful faces, they have athletic bodies, they have charming personalities, and they have intelligence to boot. These people are born winners, and life just seems to come easily to them. They didn't do anything to deserve these privileges, of course. It was just the luck of the draw. It's not fair. Why did I have to be born like this, you might say? And you wouldn't be the first to say something like that. You deeply envy these people upon whom life has bestowed its blessings. You crave what they have, but you know that you will never have it. But you are not just going to let them win. You may never be beautiful or charismatic or athletic or creative, but maybe there's something else you can be that will allow you to gain some advantage. Maybe there is some other path to superiority over these born winners. You can be morally superior. To present yourself as being morally superior, you don't need to be more beautiful or charismatic or athletic or creative. In fact, you don't really need to do anything. In order to adopt a veneer of moral superiority, all you have to do is believe the right things and to pronounce those beliefs to the world. To believe something doesn't really require any effort or talent. It doesn't require you to create anything. Anybody can believe, even a loser like you. What kinds of beliefs should you adopt? Thinking strategically, what kinds of beliefs could advance your own interests while simultaneously making you appear to be noble and selfless? The beliefs you adopt must ultimately benefit you, of course, but they can't sound like they're benefiting you. It's not fair. That doesn't sound very noble. But justice, that is a very noble sounding word, and it means the same thing, doesn't it? I want what other people have. That too doesn't sound very noble. Equality, there is a noble sounding word, and it means the same thing, doesn't it? You will fight to make the world a more just and equal place. Who could possibly oppose that? Only someone who is pure evil could oppose justice and equality. right? What I just described there was essentially the development of what Nietzsche called ressentiment. But not only the development of ressentiment, Nietzsche said that ressentiment becomes creative and creates a morality for itself, slave morality. That is the outcome of ressentiment. It creates a morality to advance its own interests in the world. Ressentiment is what happens when somebody is resentful. And resentment can be a good thing, right? If somebody's treating you unfairly, you should be resentful, but you should do something about it, right? But if you're resentful, right, if you think that you're being treated unfairly either by other people or by life in general, but you can't do anything about it, you can't express that resentment properly by either saying something or doing something, there are multiple reasons why you might not be able to do that. I mean, maybe you're a slave, maybe you're a literal slave, and you can't say anything or else you'll be killed or whatever. But maybe you're just a weakling and a coward, right? And that's generally in our own society. I would say that's most of the time what's going on. The resentment, if you're not able to express that resentment, it turns inward, right? It curdles over time. It becomes the dominant force, right? People brood on it. They brood on their resentment. They brood on their unfair treatment. And it becomes the dominant force within their personality, and it affects everything about their worldview, right? It affects everything about how they see the world. They see the world as being fundamentally a place of unfairness, and they see the world as being fundamentally evil in some sense. And so we're going to look here at a real life example of how this can occur. It's an extreme example, and we're going to look at the manifesto of Elliot Rodger, who was the Santa Barbara mass shooter. So I read his manifesto a while back, probably a couple years ago. And in 2014, Elliot went on a rampage. He went on a shooting rampage near the campus of UC Santa Barbara. He killed 6 people. He injured 14 other people. And he called this killing spree an act of retribution. He wanted revenge. He said he wanted revenge against women, especially attractive women, because they didn't want to have sex with him. And he wanted revenge against men because they had the things that he desperately wanted, right? They had friends, they had wealth, they had sex, and that's what he wanted out of life, and he couldn't get it. And his story, right, his manifesto really is it's a picture-perfect example of Nietzsche's conceptualization of ressentiment. He is an embodiment of ressentiment in some sense. And so we're going to read some things from his manifesto. In his manifesto, he described his life as a war against cruel injustice. And he was in a similar position to the hypothetical person that I described previously. Elliot, there's just no getting around it, right? We like to say that everybody's born with some strengths and all, it doesn't have to work out that way. Elliot was a loser. He was a born loser. He wasn't good at anything. Nobody respected him. Girls thought he was creepy because he was extremely creepy. And guys bullied him, right? And maybe if he would have had better parents, maybe it would have turned out differently. But he had a brother who was just fine. I think he had another sibling too, maybe later, who was fine. He didn't grow up in a terrible situation. Okay, I mean, it wasn't the best situation ever, but it wasn't that bad. And he could have been fine. But it's just the way he was. And Elliot knew that he was a loser. Right? I mean, he understood this. He wasn't he wasn't delusional about it. But at the same time, he craved superiority, and he did everything he could to construe himself as being superior. And he understood at some level. I mean, it's very obvious in his writings that he understood in some level that was a kind of game that he was playing. He understood that he was really just really pathetic, but he did everything he could to construe himself as superior, even when the world continually signaled to him that he was not. And so he saw other men, at least in this part of his psyche, right, where he was construing himself as superior, he saw other men as being stupid buffoons, and he was the supreme gentleman. He just couldn't understand why no woman wanted him. Okay, so Eliot's manifesto is unique because he is a very articulate writer, and he's very self-aware. And I think he was an introspective kid. He really understood himself and his motivations. It's very dark. But I do think he clearly understood himself. And the fact that he was so honest about his motivations and so self-aware and relatively articulate as a writer means that his manifesto can be of some use to a psychologist like myself. So we're going to ask here, what is it that motivates somebody like Elliot Rodger to take his revenge against seemingly innocent people? So I'm going to read some things from his manifesto. I'm going to read quite a few things, but I think it's helpful to read these things because it gives you an idea of where the mind can go when it goes down this really dark hole that Eliot was in, he was in a very dark place. And it's going to give you some idea of right where this train of thought, right, this envy and resentment, where that can really lead somebody. So I'm just going to read some things from his manifesto, and I quote, "By nature, I am a very jealous person. Jealousy and envy, those are two feelings that would dominate my entire life and bring me immense pain." Elsewhere, he said, and I quote, that as my 4th grade year approached its end, my little 9-year-old self had another revelation about how the world works. I realized that there were hierarchies, that some people were better than others. The peaceful and innocent environment of childhood where everyone had an equal footing was all over. The time of fair play was at its end. Life is a competition and a struggle, and I was slowly starting to realize it. When I became aware of this common social structure at my school, I also started to examine myself and compare myself to these cool kids. I realized with some horror that I wasn't cool at all. I envied the cool kids, and I wanted to be one of them. Elsewhere, he said, and I quote, that it crushed me a little inside to see that I was a failure at skateboarding after more than a year of practicing it. I saw 8-year-old boys at the skate park who could do a kickflip with ease, and it made me so angry. Why did I fail at everything I tried? I asked myself. End quote. He was a born failure. Sad story, but whatever. So elsewhere he said, and I quote, that Max told me about all the sexual experiences he had. Max was his friend, or kind of his friend. The more he talked about it, the more envious I became. On top of that, his family was extremely wealthy, and they owned a sprawling mansion in the countryside. Where's the justice, I thought. Why couldn't I have been born into that life? End quote. What's so funny about this is that Eliot was not born into poverty at all. I mean, his parents were relatively wealthy compared to most people. But it's always, somebody's always got more. We can always be envious of whoever's got more. He said elsewhere, and I quote, that I developed extreme feelings of envy, hatred, and anger towards anyone who has a sex life. I saw them as the enemy. I began to have fantasies of becoming very powerful and stopping everyone from having sex. I wanted to take their sex away from them, just like they took it away from me. I saw sex as an evil and barbaric act, all because I was unable to have it. End quote. This is, I think, the most pathetic emotion that anybody can have, right? It's so pathetic that I can't have it, and therefore nobody can have it, right? I mean, that's ressentiment, right? That's where it leads. He said, and I quote, that I formed an ideology in my head of how the world should work. I was fueled both by my desire to destroy all of the injustices of the world and to exact revenge on everyone I envy and hate. I spent all of my time studying in my room, reading books about history, politics, and sociology, trying to learn as much as I can. I became a new person, furiously driven by a goal. End quote. Now that's really interesting, right? Because he became motivated, at least for a short period of time, he became motivated to learn more about the world. But why? Why did he want to learn more about the world? So that he could destroy all of the injustices of the world and to exact revenge on everyone he envied and hated, right? It was about justice and it was about revenge. That's what motivated him to go down the path of intellectual development, which I find really interesting. It's a little different from my motivations, I would say. Okay, so he said elsewhere, and I quote, that for my whole life, I was never talented at anything I tried. I was too physically weak to play sports with other boys when I was little. I never became professional at skateboarding, no matter how much I practiced, and I was never that skilled at any video games I played. Deep down, I've always known that I had no talents, and I've always tried not to think about it. He said elsewhere, and I quote, that to see another male be successful with females is torture for males like us who have no success with females. I was so angry that I told James of all of the acts of revenge I wanted to exact on those popular boys. I told him my desire to flay them alive, to strip the skins off their flesh and make them scream in agony as punishment for living a better life than me. End quote. Well, that's where it can go, right? I mean, that's where that can go, right? These boys who he wanted to flay alive, they didn't do anything to him. All they did was be successful with women, right? And that made him so envious and so desirous of revenge that he wanted to flay them alive and make them scream in agony. He said elsewhere, and I quote, that my life was devoid of friends, devoid of girls, devoid of sex, and devoid of love. The only thing I could do was even the score. I wanted to make everyone else suffer just as they had made me suffer. I wanted revenge. He said elsewhere, and I quote, that I couldn't help but feel a bitter form of envy at all of the rich kids at the concert. They grew up in lavish mansions, indulged in excessive opulence, and will never have to worry about anything in their pleasurable, hedonistic lives. I would take great pleasure in watching all of those rich families burn alive. End quote. So that's Elliot Rodger. So Elliot Rodger did have some decent writing skills, but he's not really a very sophisticated thinker. I mean, he could write okay, and he was self-aware, but he wasn't an intellectual. And his attempt at creating an ideology, right? So he attempted to form this kind of ideology in which he was going to ban sex or redistribute sex from attractive men to him. It's laughable, right? It's something that nobody would go along with. But this should make us wonder, I think, right? We know that all these personality traits are distributed on a continuum, right? And Eliot was clearly on a very extreme end of the. I mean, we're all capable, I think, of envy to some degree, but Eliot would literally break down and cry when he saw a man kissing a woman, or like a couple together. Like, it literally made him cry multiple times because he was so envious of it. This is something I think I have never experienced. Man, it's a foreign thing for me, but we all can experience this to some degree, but he was on the extreme end, right? But you can imagine this as a continuum, right? And some people feel this way a little more than others, and some people feel it a little less, right? And so we might imagine, right? What if we had somebody who had these same motivations, this burning envy and this desire for revenge based on their own insufficiency? What if we found those in somebody who was a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more well-read? And we might wonder how they would use those motivations, right? What would those motivations drive them to concoct in the form of an ideology that would advance their interests in the world? And we might wonder whether people like that, right? People who have that particular kind of vision of the world would join together in a group effort to advance their own interests. Well, this is essentially what Nietzsche believed has happened within Western culture. Within Western culture, many people who are born losers, but are smart losers, right? So they're kind of smart, right? So they've got some intellect, but no power, let's say. They have developed a particular strategy for gaining an advantage over the strong and healthy. They disguise their hatred and their envy and their desire for revenge as justice and equality. And of course, I'm talking about these in terms of outcomes rather than processes. And they disguise their secret ambitions to be tyrants with these virtuous sounding words, because of course that's what Elliot Rodger wanted to be. He wanted to be a tyrant. He wanted to keep everyone from having sex, and he wanted to redistribute, wealth and all this stuff. And so Nietzsche believed that these motivations which drove Elliot Rodger, this envy and desire for revenge, which was disguised as a pursuit of justice, are both common and insidious. I'm going to quote Nietzsche at length here in terms of what he said about this, because I don't think I could say it any better than he did. Nietzsche is going to describe in this passage that I'm going to read, how born losers, people who are like Eliot but a little bit more sophisticated, generally speaking, can adopt a pseudo-virtuous stance in order to gain some superiority, at least some perceived superiority over the strong and well-constituted. And I think the overlap between Nietzsche's analysis and the experience of Elliot Rodger should be relatively obvious. Nietzsche said, and I quote, "The sick are man's greatest danger, not the evil, not the beasts of prey, those who are failures from the start, downtrodden, crushed. It is they, the weakest, who must undermine life among men, who call into question and poison most dangerously our trust in life, in man, and in ourselves. Where does one not encounter that veiled glance which burdens one with a profound sadness, that inward turn glance of the born failure which betrays how such a man speaks to himself, that glance which is a sigh. If only I were someone else, sighs this glance, but there is no hope of that. I am who I am. How could I ever get free of myself? And yet I am sick of myself. It is on such soil, on swampy ground, that every weed, every poisonous plant grows. always so small, so hidden, so false, so saccharine. Here the worms of vengefulness and rancor swarm. Here the air stinks of secrets and concealment. Here the web of the most malicious of all conspiracies is being spun constantly. The conspiracy of the suffering against the well-constituted and victorious. Here the aspect of the victorious is hated. And what mendaciousness and falsehood is employed to disguise that this hatred is hatred. What a display of grand words and postures. What an art of honest calumny. Calumny means slander, basically. These failures, what noble eloquence flows from their lips. How much sugary, slimy, humble submissiveness swims in their eyes. What do they really want? At least to represent justice, love, wisdom, superiority. That is the ambition of the lowest, the sick. And how skillful such an ambition makes them. Admire above all the forger's skill with which the stamp of virtue, even the ring, the golden-sounding ring of virtue, is here counterfeited. They monopolize virtue, these weak, hopelessly sick people. There is no doubt of it. We alone are the good and the just, they say. We alone are men of good will. They walk among us as embodied reproaches, as warnings to us, as if health, well-constitutedness, strength, pride, and the sense of power were in themselves necessarily vicious things for which one must pay some day and pay bitterly. How ready they themselves are at bottom to make one pay. How they crave to be hangmen. There is among them an abundance of the vengeful, disguised as judges, who constantly bear the word justice in their mouths like poisonous spittle, always with pursed lips, always ready to spit upon all who are not discontented but go their way in good spirits. The will of the weak to represent some form of superiority, their instinct for devious paths to tyranny over the healthy. Where can it not be discovered, this will to power of the weakest? End quote. So we can ask ourselves now, why is it that the madness and relativism of postmodernism morphed into an ideology predicated on dismantling power relations, as McWhorter put it, or equality? Jordan Peterson, I think, did a nice job of analyzing Nietzsche's position about this. In this Akira the Dawn video, which I recommend you listen to, he reads a passage that I'm about to read from Nietzsche called On the Tarantulas. And this was Jordan Peterson's introduction to that passage, and I think he got it basically right. He said, and I quote, that this is from Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, of course, you probably know that Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced the death of God. What he meant by that was that the fundamental metaphysics underlying Western culture had lost their foundation. One of the consequences of that would be the disintegration of the idea of value itself, and especially of value hierarchies. Nietzsche thought that one of the inevitable consequences of that would be a dramatic move towards a doctrine of radical equality. You see, because if value itself is destroyed, the value distinctions between things, so that not one thing is any better than any other, there's no reason for hierarchies of virtue or of value. And so the equality doctrine is a logical outcome of that. End quote. Okay, so we talked about, in the first video of part 6, we lost this structure, this hierarchy of value that had coordinated Western culture for a very long time, right? Well, when you lose that structure, right, everything becomes relativized, right? Everything becomes, relative to each other. And the logical outcome of that, in some sense, the logical outcome of that is that, well, everything is of equal value, right? And so a doctrine of radical equality is a logical outcome of that. Without a clear hierarchy of value, right? All ways of life are seen as being equal, and all hierarchies of competence, right? So we talked about how men put themselves into these flexible hierarchies of competence in order to pursue a shared goal. What happens if your culture doesn't have any shared goal that it's pursuing? Well, then the hierarchy of competence doesn't make any sense. What is it for? It's just hierarchy for the sake of hierarchy at that point, right? Well, it kind of makes sense then that if a culture doesn't have any shared aim, then any hierarchy within that culture is, you can see it as being unjust, right? The shared aim is like a non-zero sum game that the culture is pursuing, right? Where everybody can benefit from it. But if you don't have that, well, then it is in some sense the logical conclusion that hierarchies of competence become unjust. Now, the whole story is more complicated than this, because Nietzsche believed, and I believe as well, that Christianity's emphasis on the equality of souls had an important role to play in this story. I'm not going to go into that here. I wrote an article about this. The article is called On the Hatred of the Behavioral Genetics of Intelligence. It's on my Substack. I'll put the link in the description. So we're going to skip that part of the story for now. But whatever the case may be, Nietzsche believed that out of the death of God, there would arise a new religion, essentially, a religion in which equality would be the highest value. And that is what has emerged in the humanities and in intellectual culture in general. This religion of equality in terms of outcomes, not in terms of procedures. And equality would essentially play the role of God in this new religion. Right? It's like the hierarchy has been dismantled, and there's and so everything is of equal value. And so that's the logical conclusion, right? That equality is the highest value in some sense. So Nietzsche believed that the death of God would provide an opportunity for these sick, weak, resentful individuals to gain a foothold and to advance their ideology of equality in Western culture. And so now I'm going to read what Nietzsche had to say about these preachers of equality. And I quote, "Behold, this is the hole of the tarantula. Do you want to see the tarantula itself? Here hangs its web. Touch it, that it tremble. There it comes willingly. Welcome, tarantula. Your triangle and symbol sits black on your back. And I also know what sits in your soul. Revenge sits in your soul. Wherever you bite, black scabs grow. Your poison makes the soul whirl with revenge. Thus, I speak to you in a parable, you who make souls whirl, you preachers of equality. To me, you are tarantulas, and secretly vengeful, but I shall bring your secrets to light. Therefore I laugh in your faces with my laughter of the heights. Therefore I tear at your webs, that your rage may lure you from out of your lie holes, and your revenge may leap out from behind your word, justice. For that man be delivered from revenge, that is for me a bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long storms. The tarantulas, of course, would have it otherwise. What justice means to us is precisely that the world be filled with the storms of our revenge. Thus they speak to each other. And will to equality shall henceforth be the name for virtue, and against all that has power we want to raise our clamor. You preachers of equality, the tyrannomania of impotence clamors thus out of you for equality. Your most secret ambitions to be tyrants thus shroud themselves in words of virtue, aggrieved conceit, repressed envy, perhaps the conceit and envy of your fathers, erupts from you as a flame and as the frenzy of revenge. What was silent in the Father speaks in the Son, and I often found the Son the unveiled secret of the Father. They are like religious enthusiasts, but it is not the heart that fires them, but revenge. And when they become elegant and cold, it is not the spirit, but envy that makes them elegant and cold. Their jealousy leads them even on the paths of thinkers, and this is the sign of their jealousy. They always go too far, till their weariness must in the end lie down to sleep in the snow. Out of every one of their complaints sounds revenge. In their praise there is always a sting, and to be a judge seems bliss to them. But thus I counsel you, my friends, mistrust all in whom the impulse to punish is powerful. They are people of a low sort and stock. The hangman and the bloodhound look out of their faces. Mistrust all who talk much of their justice. Verily, their souls lack more than honey, and when they call themselves the good and the just. Do not forget that they would be Pharisees if only they had power. My friends, I do not want to be mixed up and confused with others. Some preach my doctrine of life, and are at the same time preachers of equality and tarantulas, although they are sitting in their holes, these poisonous spiders, with their backs turned on life. They speak in favor of life, but only because they wish to hurt. They wish to hurt those who now have power, for among these, the preaching of death is still most at home. If it were otherwise, the tarantulas would teach otherwise. They themselves were once the foremost slanderers of the world and burners of heretics. I do not wish to be mixed up and confused with these preachers of equality, for to me justice speaks thus: men are not equal, nor shall they become equal. What would my love of the overman be if I spoke otherwise? On 1,000 bridges and paths they shall throng to the future, and evermore war and inequality shall divide them. Thus does my great love make me speak. In their hostilities, they shall become inventors of images and ghosts. And with their images and ghosts, they shall yet fight the highest fight against one another. Good and evil, rich and poor, and high and low, and all the names of values. Arms they shall be, and clattering signs that life must overcome itself again and again. Life wants to build itself up into the heights with pillars and steps. It wants to look into vast distances and out towards stirring beauties. Therefore it requires height. And because it requires height, it requires steps and contradiction among the steps and the climbers. Life wants to climb, to overcome itself climbing. And behold, my friends, here where the tarantula has its hole, the ruins of an ancient temple rise. Behold it with enlightened eyes. Verily, the man who once piled his thoughts to the sky and these stones, he, like the wisest, knew the secret of all life, that struggle and inequality are present even in beauty, and also war for power and more power. That is what he teaches us here in the plainest parable, how divinely vault and arches break through each other in a wrestling match, how they strive against each other with light and shade, the godlike strivers. With such assurance and beauty, let us be enemies too, my friends. Let us strive against one another like gods. Alas, then the tarantula, my old enemy, bit me. With godlike assurance and beauty, it bit my finger. Punishment there must be, and justice, it thinks. And here he shall not sing songs in honor of enmity in vain. Indeed, it has avenged itself. And alas, now it will make my soul too whirl with revenge. But to keep me from whirling, my friends, tie me tight to this column. Rather would I be a stylite even, an ascetic priest, than a whirl of revenge. Verily, Zarathustra is no cyclone or whirlwind, and if he is a dancer, he will never dance the tarantella. Thus spoke Zarathustra. It's very interesting to me that the way that Nietzsche describes these preachers of equality is almost identical to how John McWhorter described the elect in his book. Of course, he uses different language, but he's describing the same phenomenon. So in McWhorter's book, he said that the elect focus on battling power relations. They say that battling power relations must be the central focus of all human endeavor. And Nietzsche's Preachers of Equality says that will to equality shall henceforth be the name for virtue, and against all that has power we want to raise our clamor. McWhorter, of course, calls it a religion, and Nietzsche says that they are like religious enthusiasts. Now, in the translation from Kaufman, he just says enthusiasts. They are like enthusiasts, but he's talking about religious enthusiasts. McWhorter's elect, he says that the elect are our Pharisees, right? And that is what they act like. Nietzsche says, do not forget that they would be Pharisees if only they had power. Well, we've seen what they act like when they have power. They act like Pharisees, as McWhorter has documented and others have documented. McWhorter says that the elect consider it imperative to not only critique those who disagree with their creed, but to seek their punishment and elimination to whatever degree real-life conditions can accommodate. And Nietzsche, in reference to the Preachers of Equality, says that we should mistrust all in whom the impulse to punish is powerful. And I think that's a really good idea. McWhorter says that the elect consider it a higher wisdom to burn witches. Not literally, but the sentiment is the same. And Nietzsche, describing the Preachers of Equality, says that they themselves were once the foremost slanderers of the world and burners of heretics. And he means, by the way, that they are embodying the same spirit that burns heretics, that has always burned heretics. McWhorter says that the elect religion is eerily akin to devout Christianity. And, of course, Nietzsche believed, and I argued in the essay that I talked about earlier, which is on Substack, that the Preachers of Equality were an outgrowth of Christianity, essentially. So, given what I've just talked about here, I want to be clear that I don't think most people who buy into this stuff are really motivated by resentment and revenge. I don't think that characterizes most people. And most people are just go along with the crowd, right? Most people are motivated by careerism. So in academia, you want to have a good career, give lip service to this little religion, okay? And you'll get hired, you'll get promotions and all this stuff, right? I know somebody personally who literally got a job purely because of her ideological beliefs, and she bragged about this too. And I like this person. She's a person that I like in general, but she's not an extremely productive academic. But she basically got a job because of her ideology, and she was proud of that. Whatever. Some of the elect are highly agreeable people who have been convinced that this view of things is the compassionate way of viewing the world, right? That's what agreeable people want. They want to be compassionate. My experience has been that people who are like that, and this is generally this characterizes the women who are into this thing. These are the people who are most apt to leave the faith at some point in time. They leave the religion because they come to realize that the so-called compassion of the elect is a mask for less noble motivations. I'll put a link to this YouTuber Lacey Green, who kind of had this come to Jesus moment about this stuff. And her story is really interesting, but it's relatively common. Most of what you might call the elect are really just regular people. They've been drawn to the ideology because of social incentives or because of its surface level compassionate stance. Most people just don't think that deeply about these things, right? They if your friends are doing something, if your colleagues are doing something, you just do it too because that's what you do, right? That's the way most people do things. But at the core of the new religion, there are a small number, and I do think it's a relatively small number, of what you might call true believers. And these are the ones who are the most censorious and venomous in their attacks on heretics. And what's interesting is that even though the thing as a whole is clearly more appealing to women, my experience has been that the most venomous people they tend to be men. It's not always the case. I mean, these are averages, and these are going off of my own experience, right? I don't have data about this, but a lot of these true believers are men, interestingly enough. And although these true believers would like to represent themselves as embodiments of wisdom and virtue, that's not what I see. I see something different. I see what Nietzsche saw. They want to represent justice, love, wisdom, superiority. That is the ambition of the lowest, the sick. There is among them an abundance of the vengeful, disguised as judges, who constantly bear the word justice in their mouths like poisonous spittle. And that is what I see. And these true believers are resentful losers, and they are taking their revenge on everyone who is not quite as weak and miserable and pathetic as they are. That's what I see. So we've talked about how this thing has a very feminine, it's effeminate, right? It has an effeminacy to it. And it does appeal more to women in general, even though a lot of the real core true believers, I think, are men. It does appeal more to women. And so we can ask ourselves, right, why is it that this ideology appeals to women more than men on average? And Joyce Benenson, we've talked about her before. She's a developmental psychologist and evolutionary developmental psychologist. And she has this book, Worriers and Worriers, where she talks about sex differences. And it is simply the case, and it's an empirically verified finding that women are far more likely than men to insist on the maintenance of egalitarian relations, and they tend to be more likely to be envious of people, especially other women, who show signs of superiority. Joyce says in her book, and I quote, that my students and I asked almost 200 adolescent and adult participants to imagine that they had done really well either academically or socially. When we asked them how they would feel, every one of them told us that they would feel very happy. Then we asked them how their closest same-sex friends would feel. Our female participants, both girls and young women, reported that their friends might not like them anymore. They checked the following items more than males did. My friend would feel betrayed by me, disappointed in me, angry with me, and jealous of me. They said their friends would feel much better if they had all done equally well. End quote. She says elsewhere, and I quote, that dozens of studies confirm what clinical interviews repeatedly find. Beginning as early as they learn to speak, girls behave as if all of them are totally equal. Speaking generally here, of course. They know that no one will like them if they attempt to sound superior. Their words show this clearly. Females speak to one another as equals at all times, from early childhood into old age, across diverse cultures. They use the words we and us more often than males do. Should a preschool girl wish to do something that no one else thought of, she cannot even say something as trivial as, I just had a great idea. I'm going to go play in the kitchen. You come with me. She knows that would turn her female peers against her. Instead, she might inquire politely, do you want to play in the kitchen? She might make a tentative suggestion that includes everyone, such as, let's go play in the kitchen. Women do the same, end quote. And of course, we're speaking in general terms here, but anybody who's been around groups of men and groups of women know that the way that men speak to each other is extremely different from the way that women speak to each other, generally speaking. Generally speaking, with men, there's a lot of shit talk. And little dominance games are going on all the time. It depends on the kind of men that you're around, right? It differs depending on the specifics of the group. At least when I've been around like groups of women, you don't see that. You don't ever see like that. There might be teasing, but it's not like that at all. And it is much more egalitarian, let's say. But anyways, these are generalities. But anyway, this is based on her research as a developmental psychologist. She said something else a little bit later. She provides a specific example about this, and I quote, "In Goodwin's year-long study of African-American children and adolescents in a working-class Philadelphia neighborhood, the same rule is followed. No girl can compete. All girls are equal and none is superior. The only exceptions are if one girl is much older than the others, or if a girl gets to play the mother or teacher while they are engaging in pretend play. Every girl, of course, wants to play the mother or teacher. The others repeatedly remind her, however, that she is not any better than anyone else. She is just pretending for a short time to be better." It became apparent one day to some of the girls in Goodwin's study that one of their own was acting superior. It was an accident, of course. Goodwin described what happened. Several of the girls who played together in the neighborhood were between 10 and 12 years of age. All the 12-year-old girls' clothes came from older female relatives or from thrift shops. One 10-year-old girl named Annette, however, had a mother who bought her new clothes. Over the course of several months, because of her nicer clothes, 3 12-year-old girls ganged up on Annette. The older girls decided to never talk to Annette again and to not let anyone else talk to her either for months. Their treatment of Annette was so bad that Annette's mother almost sold their home and moved away. It was heartbreaking for Annette, end quote. And so there's this weird kind of envy thing going on there, this weird insistence on equality and the social exclusion of anyone who doesn't adhere to that norm. So, and so that example demonstrates both of these issues that I'm going to get at here, which is that women's relationships are more egalitarian, and social exclusion is a competitive tactic that women use that men don't use in the same way, generally speaking. When men compete with each other, and of course men compete with each other, they tend to do it openly and without much subtlety. Right? There's not any subtle social games going on. Right? Like when guys compete, generally speaking, it is very overt. It is one guy sort of dominance challenging another, and then they may fight. Fighting obviously happens a lot more among young men than women. But women cannot compete openly, right, without evoking the ire, right, the disdain of other women. But women, of course, still compete, and they do so more subtly, right, through social exclusion, through gossip, and so on. Joyce Benenson reviews all of this in her book. My colleague Tanya Reynolds does a lot of really interesting work on this kind of stuff. And this is basically how the religion of equality, whatever you want to call it, diversity, equity, and inclusion, multicultural, I don't care. It's got, a name never sticks with this thing. Who cares? Everybody knows what it is. But this is how it works, right? If you don't conform to their stupid ideas, you will be gossiped about behind your back. And this is something I have personally witnessed on multiple occasions. If you say anything to violate the orthodoxies, right, they'll get together and do a little gossip about you. And you'll be excluded from job opportunities and so on. If you're a professor who deviates from the orthodoxy, grad students will, as a compliant little herd of cattle, they will refuse to take your classes, and they will constantly talk shit about you. Again, this is something that I have personally witnessed. They're little priests, right? And most of the people just go along with it because it's easier to go along with it than not, right? I don't think most people really care, but there's a little core of little priests and mostly priestesses who facilitate this kind of exclusion of anybody who violates their dogmas. Joyce Benenson says about this process of social exclusion, and I quote, "How does social exclusion occur in humans? The process is quite simple. A girl or woman alerts her female peers to the presence of a female competitor who is outstanding in some manner, or maybe is just an easy target. The first responder spreads the word through gossip or written notes. This typically happens initially in the target's absence, reducing the risk of retaliation and potential bodily harm. Should the target be present, the first responder identifies her discreetly using nonverbal gestures that other females can easily decode, and that potentially protective males miss completely. For example, the first responder can roll her eyes in disgust or flip her hair angrily in the direction of the target. If the first responder and her female peers smile and otherwise behave politely, the target may not immediately realize what is happening. That safeguards members of the female coalition who can leave the scene before the target catches on. Next, the members of the coalition must meet to discuss their tactics. Direct threats can backfire. The target might retaliate. She will find out about the gossip. Smiling and politeness mixed up with subtle threats may disorient her, but only temporarily. As soon as she figures out what's really going on, what's to stop her from taking countermeasures. Eliminating her from the community by social exclusion provides a safer and ultimately more beneficial solution. Social exclusion is an important strategy for eliminating competitors, one at a time without risk of retaliation. Girls practice it from early childhood. It has been used by females across diverse cultures in middle childhood and adolescence and adulthood. End quote. This is just called cancel culture. I mean, that's how it manifests in the culture at large. It's social exclusion. Right? This is female intersexual competition applied to the culture war, essentially. And that's what this ideology does, right? It socially excludes anybody who violates one of its stupidities. It is also anti-wisdom. And I say it's the opposite of wisdom. It promotes ideas that are the opposite of wisdom. In their 2018 book, The Coddling of the American Mind, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt argue that universities have been infantilizing students and teaching them things that are utterly opposed to everything that our ancient wisdom traditions have taught us. And I agree. I've been in these universities for 6 years. I know exactly what the general message is. You are a victim. You are a weak, pathetic little victim. I mean, that's basically, obviously they don't say that directly, but that is, anytime anything happens, it's like, oh, we've got a safe space for you to cry your little eyes out. I don't know. It's so crazy, man. Like how they treat students as being so fragile and just easily breakable, And so Lukianoff and Haidt point to the three great untruths that are being promoted within universities. The first one is that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And this is largely about avoiding discomfort from campus speakers or from professors who say things that are controversial and so on. But in fact, the opposite is true, generally speaking. Of course, you can be an idiot about it. Getting your legs cut off doesn't make you stronger. But generally speaking, complex systems like us benefit from adversity. We need adversity. We need anomalies, right? We need anomalies. That's how we grow. That's how we become more than what we are. The second great untruth is to always trust your feelings. And this is sometimes construed as your lived experience. But then sometimes people will literally define, like microaggressions are defined in terms of how the person who receives it feels about it, right? As if that's like some objective criteria, which is silliness. But I have nothing against feelings, right? Feelings are good. It's good to have feelings. Okay, have your feelings. And it's a cliche to say that you have to use your head and your heart, right? But yeah, your feelings are necessary and sometimes they're stupid, right? You shouldn't always trust your feelings because what do you know? And then the third great untruth is that life is a battle between good people and evil people. And of course, we've talked about in part 5, everybody is always pursuing their adaptive goals. And the world is always more complicated than our own simplified moralistic narratives can convey. There's always shades of gray, and people, I have a lot of disdain for this ideology. I don't have disdain for many of the people who adhere to it because I've known some of these people. I've known them very well. And some of them can be great teachers and great mentors and good friends, right? But when it comes to this, they turn into little priests. They turn into like the worst version of themselves, and we have to separate the ideas from the people to a large degree. Bad ideas can occupy otherwise cool and decent people. And This ideology, right, this ideology that has infected the universities, is teaching students the opposite of wisdom. It's anti-wisdom. It's antithetical to wisdom. It's teaching them how to be weak, infantile, moralistic little tattletales and ideologues. Right? That's what it's teaching them to be. The opposite of a wise person, as far as I'm concerned. It is the religion of the terrible, devouring mother. Right? So we talked about, the great mother has two aspects. One is wisdom, right, and one is madness, or one is the terrible mother, right. And we've talked about madness being one, but this is something that morphed out of that cultural madness. But it's related to this archetype of the devouring mother, right? Because the devouring mother is the mother who overprotects her children in such a way that she blocks their proper development, and she does this because sometimes because she's like envious of them, right? It's hard to explain. So I'm going to read what Jordan Peterson said about this, because I think he's got the symbolism essentially correct. Jordan Peterson said, and I quote, that Freud was no dummy when he pointed to the fact that the devouring mother was one of the major impediments to proper human development. He knew that because he looked deep into the darkest human families and saw this proclivity of the overprotective mother to destroy the developing integrity of the child in order to keep the child infantile and to cling to that relationship instead of developing a life for herself and letting the child go flourish. That's Hansel and Gretel. In that story, you're lost in the woods. Why? Well, your family is broken up and you have an evil stepmother, so now you're lost in the woods. And then you come across a gingerbread house. That's pretty damn convenient. You need a house, and it's more than you could even hope for. It's not just a house. It's a house made out of candy. Well, what's inside a house made out of candy? A witch who wants to fatten you up and eat you. And that's the devouring mother. That's an old fairy tale. One of the things we won't honestly discuss in our society is the fundamental nature of female political psychopathology. There's male political psychopathology, obviously, and that's what the feminists complain about all the time when they talk about the oppressive patriarchy and toxic masculinity. There's no shortage of toxic masculinity. So is there any toxic femininity? Well, not if the feminine is just the oppressed virgin goddess who is nature. But how about we don't live in that fantasy world? And we know that there is female political pathology, the tendency to infantilize everyone, and the tendency to assume that everyone who doesn't go along with the infantilization is properly characterized as a predator. And so you're wondering why the universities are turning into extended daycares. Well, a lot of the reason for that is that women who don't have anything better to do are turning university students into the infants they never had. I don't know if we'll be mature enough. I don't know when we'll be mature enough to have that conversation, end quote. And it's true, man. I mean, I've witnessed this with my own eyes. It's unbelievable how some people treat students like they're infants, like they're little tiny babies who can't do anything for themselves and can't think for themselves and need to be protected from everything. It's not just students, like it's research participants too. The amount of hoops you have to jump through just to give somebody a survey is unbelievable, man. IRBs are crazy. It's a total, I mean, it's treating everybody as infants, right? And anybody who doesn't go along with it is instantly categorized as a predator, right? Well, I mean, that's the categorization, right? Everybody's either an infant or they're a predator, and that's how they treat everyone, essentially. Ursula from The Little Mermaid. Interestingly enough, I do think that she's a very good depiction of the devouring mother. What does she say? She says, "Poor unfortunate souls. I help them. And it's happened once or twice that somebody couldn't pay the price, and I'm afraid I had to rake them across the coals. I'm not asking for much. All I want from you is your voice." And that is all that it asks, right? It says, you poor unfortunate soul, you little victim. You victim of society, of the world, of whatever, of all this oppression, right? I will help you. All you have to do is give me your voice. And all you have to do is conform to my dogmas. That's what this religion requires. That's basically all it requires. You just have to say what it wants you to say. And you get, in return, you get some instant social status. You get to be a victim. or you get to be a savior of victims, right? And you get a potential career in academia or journalism or activism, and you get a newfound sense of meaning and purpose because now you're defending the world against evil predators. You're protecting equality and justice from these evil predators on the outside, right? You get all of that, and all that it demands of you is your conformity. And if you don't conform, then it will rake you across the coals. But that's what it is. The terrible, devouring mother is very compassionate. She loves to take care of victims and the downtrodden. And if you help her, she will provide you with ready-made social status and a cushy job, potentially. Maybe an internship at a prestigious media outlet. Right? She'll provide meaning and purpose, and all she demands is your voice. So what is feminine political psychopathology? As far as I'm concerned, it's the insistence on hyper-egalitarian relationships when flexible hierarchies of competence is what are necessary. People defer in their competence, no matter what you do. Right? This is especially true of scientific inquiry. What we want to do as academics, right, as a society, is not to divvy out rewards to people based on their victimhood. Who cares about that, right? We're trying to extract, we're trying to exploit talented people for everything we can exploit them for. Like, that's what we're trying to do. We want to wring them of their potential, find talented people, put them in positions where we can exploit their talent, right? That's what we're trying to do, so that they can create and discover things that benefit everybody. Okay, who cares about their hardships? It's irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. The feminine political psychopathology divides the world up into helpless victims on the one hand and powerful predatory perpetrators on the other. It infantilizes everyone in the victim group, which inhibits their proper development into powerful and competent adults. It weaponizes coordinated social exclusion against anyone who deviates from the orthodoxies. That is what is going on in the universities and in journalism and so on, in the Western intellectual and artistic culture in general. And of course, there's masculine political psychopathology. We'll talk about that in part 9 a little bit more. So we talked in the last part about this, about Wolin's 1999 figure demonstrating the process of change in complex hierarchical systems. And out of the madness, right, out of that chaos of postmodernism, this ideology, which I do think is very stupid, has emerged as one of these variations, that is competing. At the moment, it's competing relatively successfully to be retained in the deep structure of Western culture. So we have, this disruption. The disruption was essentially the death of God, and then the forming of variations. And then there's a sorting, and it's kind of what we're doing right now, right? We're sorting through these different variations. And this is one of them, which is competing for its retention in the deep structure of Western culture. It wants to be Western culture, right? That's what it wants. I mean, I say it, I'm personifying it here a little bit, but you know what I mean. Like this thing in the universities, it wants hegemony, right? It wants to be the culture. How about no, thank you. This is Berkeley's diversity statement rubric, and I think it's really funny because it is a religious litmus test for excluding non-believers. Right? That's what it is. What I've copied out here are the answers you have to give to get a really high score on the diversity statement. So one of the things you have to do is express your clear knowledge of, experience with, and interest in dimensions of diversity that result from different identities, such as ethnic, socioeconomic, racial, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and cultural identities. I don't care about these things. I don't care about your ethnicity. I don't care about your socioeconomic status. I don't care about your race. I don't care about your gender. I don't care about who you're having sex with. I don't care really if you're disabled, and unless it's relevant to the task at hand. But generally speaking, these are the least interesting attributes of a human being. Okay, I don't care about them. This is irrelevant to me. Okay, your race is irrelevant to me. Your ethnicity is irrelevant to me. your socioeconomic status is irrelevant to me. I don't care about it. And they want me to be interested in this, and I'm not, and I never will be. Something else you have to do is you have to discuss diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as core values that every faculty member should actively contribute to. How about no? How about I'm going to do the opposite of that. I'm going to say that these should be it's not that diversity, equity, and inclusion aren't important in some sense. I mean, depending on how you define them. The problem is that their definitions are all over the place, depending on where you look. But sure, like there's a version of diversity that I think is important. You don't want everybody to be thinking the same and feeling the same about everything. You want some real cognitive diversity. Equity is important in the sense of treating everybody equally, right? And having the process be equal by which you determine outcomes, right? Like that's what used to be called equity. That's not what they mean by equity, and then inclusion is important in the sense that you don't want to arbitrarily exclude people for irrelevant reasons, right? So all of those things are important. But all of those things are byproducts. They are byproducts of pursuing a non-zero sum game, right? If you have a group and you're pursuing a shared goal that is valuable to everybody in the group, diversity, equity, and inclusion come along as byproducts. Right? They're byproducts. You don't need to value them. They happen on their own because you're going to value the potential that comes out of having real cognitive diversity. You're going to value placing people in positions where their competence can be adequately exploited, right? That's equity. You're going to value not excluding people arbitrarily for no good reason, right? Because that would be detrimental to your goal, right? So that's inclusion. These things are byproducts, right? They're not values. But what they want is for me to value diversity of like racial. Who cares? Who cares? I don't care. It's irrelevant. So ridiculous, man. It's a religion, right? They want you to be a little priest. They want you to tell them, I'm going to be a little priest for your religion. I'm going to spread the gospel. And that's what they want you to do. Another one. You're supposed to convincingly express your intent with examples to be a strong advocate for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. No, I'm not going to be. And that means that I can never get a job at Berkeley, and I can never get a job at anywhere else that is going to require this bullshit. It's bullshit. And I know that there's a lot of people who go along with this stuff and they know better. There's a lot of people who go along with it because they don't really know better, because they're just going, most people don't think deeply about these things at all. But some people do, and they go along with it anyways. I don't know about you people, because I've known people like that, and they say, you know what, I'll say something when I get tenure. I don't know about you. I think that this ideology benefits straight white men more than it benefits anybody else. And I'm not saying that to be controversial. I really believe that. I think that the people who benefit from this ideology overall, relatively speaking, are straight white men. Why? I had a lot of problems in my early 20s. I was very ill, essentially, for quite a while. And I talked about this in my first video of this series. And I think it has been really beneficial for me that I didn't have a ready-made ideology that would have allowed me to offload my responsibility onto society or onto systemic racism or whatever, right? Whatever you want to offload your responsibility on. Nobody was telling me that I was a victim, and I had nobody to blame for my problems except for myself. And thank God for that. Even if society is partly to blame for what happened to me, and maybe it is, it doesn't matter. It would have been impossible for me to change society in the very pathetic state that I was in at that point. What I could do, what everybody can always do, is change yourself. And that's what I did. And I wonder, and I really do wonder, what would have happened if I would have had a legion of these resentful idiots trying to convince me that what I actually was a blameless victim of social forces beyond my control? What if my greatest privilege as a straight white man is actually the fact that I don't have anyone trying to convince me that I'm a victim? I think that is a privilege, especially for young people. I think that as straight white men, we are very privileged. Nobody is trying to convince me that I'm a victim. Thank God for that. You are not a victim. You don't have to be anyways. Everybody's got problems, man. And some people's problems are a lot worse than others, but adopting a victim mindset is no solution to any of them. My problem with this ideology is a little bit personal. That's probably been a little bit apparent here. I think I was made for academia. I mean, I really do. I think I would be a great academic. I think I would be a good teacher. I think I would be a good researcher. I think I could do that as a career. And I know that I can never do it because I think that there is an infection, a rot at the core of the university, at the core of university culture. And I will never give any lip service to that rot whatsoever. And because of that, I can never have a career in academia. And I know that. I've accepted that at this point. It took me a long time to accept that, but I have accepted it. I would need to sacrifice my integrity. That's what they would require of me. In order for me to have a real career in academia, I would have to sacrifice my integrity, and I'm not going to do it. And I'm not doing it. It's not because I'm noble or something like that. It's not that at all. I just said, I think, and I really do. I mean, I think that your best bet in the long run is to maintain your integrity. I do think that's your best bet. I'm no fucking saint, okay? But forcing people to make this choice is bullshit. It's bullshit. And people should stop putting up with it. I think that dividing everyone up into little victim categories and divvying out rewards to people based on how victimized they are is pretty much the definition of a zero-sum game. There will be winners and there will be losers, right? Those who can demonstrate their sufficient victimhood are going to be winners. They're going to be absolute winners. While those who cannot or refuse to demonstrate their victimhood will lose. And we've seen recently a number of women in academia have been caught impersonating other races or ethnicities, right? Women pretending to be another race within academia, because if you're a white woman, you can advance your career by pretending to be a Latina woman, which is really crazy. But it's happened multiple times at this point. Probably, generally speaking, stuff like that, we don't catch everyone. Right? We probably don't even catch most people. There's probably a lot more out there. Demonstrating evidence of your victimhood has literally become a viable career strategy in certain parts of academia. It depends on what field you're in. And of course, that's a zero-sum game. As far as I'm concerned, the pursuit of knowledge is a true non-zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game. Everybody benefits from the fruits of the scientific enterprise. That's what I'm going to do. Right? I'm going to do my best to pursue real knowledge of the world. And I'm not going to join your little religion. I think that competence and merit and truth and the pursuit of knowledge are way more important than diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, I think diversity, equity, and inclusion, generally speaking, come along as byproducts of pursuing knowledge or pursuing truth. They're means to ends, and they're not ends in themselves. I think that actual anti-racism is really important. I think that racism is a very big problem in the United States and elsewhere. It's a complicated problem, right? I couldn't do justice to the problem in this video at all, right? It's a very complicated problem. But it's not going to be solved by this nonsense that we've just talked about, right? That's the opposite of a solution. Kurzban, Tooby, and Cosmides in this 2001 paper showed something that was really interesting. I'm just going to read the abstract of the paper. Of course, the reference will be in the description. They said, and I quote, "Previous studies have established that people encode the race of each individual they encounter, and they do so via computational processes that appear to be both automatic and mandatory. If true, this conclusion would be important, because categorizing others by their race is a precondition for treating them differently according to race. Here, we report experiments using unobtrusive measures showing that categorizing individuals by race is not inevitable, and supporting an alternative hypothesis, that encoding by race is instead a reversible byproduct of cognitive machinery that evolved to detect coalitional alliances. The results show that subjects encode coalitional affiliations as a normal part of person representation. More importantly, when cues of coalitional affiliation no longer track or correspond to race, subjects markedly reduce the extent to which they categorize others by race, and indeed may cease doing so entirely. Despite a lifetime's experience of race as a predictor of social alliance, less than 4 minutes of exposure to an alternate social world was enough to deflate the tendency to categorize by race. These results suggest that racism may be a volatile and eradicable construct that persists only so long as it is actively maintained through being linked to parallel systems of social alliance," end quote. Now, I think the big picture is a little more complicated than that around racism in general, but there's a very important point to be made here, which is that, we talked about in part 3 how I argued that the optimal pattern of behavior in some sense involves the discovery and facilitation of non-zero-sum games. And what the claim here from this paper is, and they present multiple experiments supporting this claim, is that when we are engaged in a non-zero-sum game with other people, we essentially forget about their race, right? We don't care. It's no longer relevant. And so actual anti-racism, real anti-racism, and not this other bullshit, involves the discovery and facilitation of non-zero-sum games, right? When you are engaged in a positive-sum game with somebody else, you don't care about their race. It's irrelevant. Who cares? Who cares? Whether somebody's black or Asian or fucking Hispanic, who cares? It's irrelevant. And so you want to reduce racism by facilitating positive-sum games, but also by appealing to our shared humanity, right? We are all in this together to some extent, and that's what people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Daryl Davis have done, right? They appeal to our shared humanity, not our differences. Yeah. So to recap, multiculturalism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice, intersectionality, I don't care what you call it, wokeness, who cares? Whatever this thing is, this thing within the universities, this religion that has emerged within the universities and within intellectual culture at large, emerged as an intellectual phenomenon out of postmodernism. This ideology or this religion essentially worships equality, but not equality in terms of processes, equality in terms of a state, in terms of power relations, in terms of the relations of power between people and between groups of people. It has a decidedly feminine character. It presents, I say it, and I'm personifying it, but whatever, it presents itself as an effeminate thing, and it obviously appeals to certain aspects of feminine psychology, and we talked about that. It is dogmatic. It is anti-truth. Anti-truth in the sense that you're not allowed to say things that are obviously true sometimes. It's obviously true. Just as an example, right? The president of Harvard at one time got in trouble for talking about increased male variability as a hypothesis explaining men's overrepresentation in certain fields. Perfectly reasonable hypothesis, well supported by theory and evidence, and he got fired for that, right? Okay, it's anti-truth in the sense that you're not allowed to talk openly about things. You're not allowed to explore ideas around these issues, because if you stumble into the wrong territory, right? Well, then you've evoked, the ire of these little priests and priestesses who will come try to get you fired from your job or whatever the case may be. It's anti-science because I don't care about the truth. Whatever, I talk about that more in my in my paper on the hatred of behavioral genetics of intelligence. It's anti-wisdom, as we talked about. It promotes ideas that are antithetical to everything that our ancient wisdom traditions have taught us. And it's anti-meritocracy. It doesn't believe in merit, at least many people at the core of the religion. Again, you get to the periphery and most people have no idea what they're doing, right? They're just, but the core that this religion emerged out of, the intellectual core, it was an attack on merit. It was an attack on the idea of competence, essentially. And I would suggest that it is a manifestation of the return of the Great Mother. It's a return of femininity to Western culture in some sense. But it's a pathology of femininity. It's the worst aspects of femininity. It represents the religion of the terrible, devouring mother who uses compassion as a guise to enact policies that inhibit proper development by keeping its adherents weak and dependent and infantile and treating them as if they're infants. It's maintained in the universities and presumably elsewhere. I mean, I have the most experience within university culture, but I know that there is a culture of fear surrounding this stuff because I hear the way people talk about it. And people are afraid to say what they really think. And I've heard multiple times people say that, they're going to wait for tenure. Doubt it. I kind of doubt it. But whatever. There is a culture of fear that maintains the orthodoxy. It maintains compliance. And it's mediated by the social and professional exclusion of heretics, essentially. Yeah. So that's it. I don't know if I did a good job at that. I really don't. But I can't redo it because I've got to move on because I've got a schedule to keep up. I have a deadline for this. I'm going to lose the software that I use to make these videos pretty soon. And so I have to finish them by a certain date. And so I have to keep my deadline moving. So what I put out here is what I'm putting out. And we'll see how it goes. I think I said everything that I wanted to say about this. And I think I've made my position on this clear, which is what I really needed to do. So the next video in part 6 is going to be about the return of wisdom. I do think that out of the death of God, let's say, and the rise of the scientific enterprise, we are seeing a reincorporation of what you might call wisdom into our worldview. And I think that's been a really good thing. And so we're going to talk about that in the next video. Hope to see you there. Goodbye.